Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with our very special guest, Jude Southerland Kessler. Elmore James got nothing on this baby. Jude is joining me, Sir Warren Brown, and we're wandering into the Beatles Kingdom. Welcome, Jude and Warren.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So good to be here.
Welcome, Jude. How you doing?
I'm doing much better than Bob's been doing, but
That's not saying much.
That's a good thing, Jude. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
You'll have to tell us about the meaning of Dr. Robert.
Yeah, I bet you could clarify that for us.
I could have sent you some of my artwork of Dr. Robert.
Well, if I kick off, who's going to be your new co-host? I know Brooke Halpern's looking for a gig. Let's see.
All right, Jude. I guess you're expecting me to start barking and not the bulldog. So, my first question to you is going to be: tell us about your upcoming new book and the series in general. And will you do that, please?
Sure. The John Lennon series is a very unusual genre because I tell John's life story in hopefully nine books. It may end up being 10. I'm trying to stick to John's number 9, but there's so much factual material that goes into each book that the books I've had to cut them short. By the time that for example, the last book was supposed to cover 1963-64, but I had 1,000 pages just on 1963, and so I had to stop and do just 63. The next book was then going to be 64-65, and again at around 1,000 pages, I had to stop and just make it about 1964. So we'll see. But somewhere around 9 or 10 books, I'm going to tell the whole story of John's life, all documented, all researched, all footnoted, but presented to the reader as a narrative. So you read it as if you're reading a novel. It sounds as if you're reading a novel, but every sentence is footnoted so that you know you're getting what the Beatles wore, what they said, what they did, what they ate even. I mean, I've even had to write to people and say, I know that the Beatles had dinner with you. What did they have to eat? We're keeping this all very, very factual, but you read it as a story. And the book that I'm working on right now is volume 5. It's called Shades of Life, and it's about 1965 in John's life, and of course, the life of his mates, the Beatles. So you're going to be with them as they make help, as John writes his second book, A Spaniard in the Works, as they go on the second world tour, the second North American tour, their autumn UK tour, and they go through everything that 1965 entails almost day by day.
Wow, that sounds really good. A lot of research and a lot of work to that. 1,000 pages a book. That would take me a lifetime to read. just what you already have. The 4 that you have in the upcoming one would take me the rest of my life to read. I am a slow reader, and I have started on your first one, and it is great so far. It's one of the best written books that I've read in a long time.
Well, thank you very much. I love the subject. And really, I thought when I started doing the research for these books back in the 80s, that I knew everything there was to know about John Lennon. It would be so easy to do. And I found out in short order that I knew absolutely nothing about John Lennon, and that I had to do a massive amount of research to write these things. So I have about 500 Lennon and Beatles books in my home, as well as DVDs and CDs, and I've done tons of live interviews with everyone that John knew, from, of course, people like Bob Wooler and Alan Williams, and John's best friend in college, Helen Anderson, with all of the people that went to college with John, like Rod Murray, who was his roommate when Rod, Stu, and John lived at Gambier Terrace, to the Quarrymen, some of the earliest people that he played music with, just tons of people who were generous with their time and really have helped me. Bill Harry, most of all. Bill has been so generous to write the foreword for all of the books and has just agreed to write the foreword for volume 5. And he is really, Bill puts up with no nonsense. I wrote a chapter in book 4 about Bill taking John to Stu's house to talk to Millie Sutcliffe after Stu's death, and Millie giving John a bunch of Stu's paintings to take home with him and showing him Stu's memorabilia and going through things with him. And when I sent it to Bill, he said, "This is terrible. This is so terrible that you're not allowed to put it in the book." So
Wow.
I was like, "What?" And so he said, "You need to rewrite it." So I wrote it and I sent it back to him. He's like, "This is better, but still not good. Write it again." So I wrote it 5 times before he said that it was acceptable. So with help like that, how can you go wrong?
That's true. How long did it take you to conduct all these interviews, and how much time did all the research and require of you?
Well, the first book took 20 years. And
Wow.
that's because I was gathering all my information. Now, I still do interviews. I'm still talking to people. For example, the last book on 1964, I talked to Art Schreiber, who toured with the Beatles on the North American tour, with Ivor Davis, who toured with them. I got to talk to all of the people who were in Walnut Ridge, Arkansas, when they landed there and saw the Beatles at the airport there. I got to talk to the DJs that introduced the Beatles and got interviews with them. So I'm still doing interviews, but the large portion of my interviews were done in the 20 years before I released book 1. I really laid the foundation by going to Liverpool 7 times and spending 8 days a week over in Liverpool, talking to people. I would do a morning interview, an afternoon interview, and an evening interview every single day that I was there, and try to hit as many people as I could, because these people are in their 80s, many of them, and since I interviewed them, many of them have already passed on, and their stories are so vibrant and colorful and detailed and accurate that you want to get it firsthand rather than getting it from someone who's telling something they overheard.
Right. That sounds good. A lot of work put into them books, and 1,000 pages. You can see that it took a lot for you to do that, and a long time. I'm going to get away from the book for just a minute, and can you tell us about your podcast and your upcoming guests?
Sure. I have a podcast called She Said, with my bestie, Lena Stagg, the author of the Recipe Records cookbook series. Lena was just on your show a few weeks ago.
Yes, she was, and she was great too.
She's a real sweetheart and a very, very knowledgeable music expert about music of all eras, from really the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, all the way up. She really loves the 60s and the 70s, but she knows music of all genres and all eras. And so she writes these cookbooks using music facts and trivia and stories to enwrap her recipes and menus with music titles, music hints and tips, and playlists that you can listen to as you're making her recipes. Well, she and I have been friends for about 10 years, and we always debate things. She'll say, "Well, I think the Stones were the best," and I'll say, "Well, I think the Beatles are the best." We'll in a friendly kind of way debate, and we said, we ought to do a radio show where we debate things, and of course have guests on and discuss and debate with them. So she said centers around the fact that I say one thing and she says another, but we always stay friends in the end. And we are excited because next year our theme is the Beatles family, and we'll be talking with people like Angie and Ruth McCartney and Chaz Newby, who was one of the Beatles, original Beatles, and Rogue and Pete Best. And we're really going to be focusing on the Beatles family as we go through 2020.
Lena's books were great. My wife had a great time co-hosting that show. And matter of fact, she was using the cookbook the other day when she was cooking dinner, and it turned out great. And she was singing along in the kitchen and moving all around. So It worked.
Well,
The
they're great. They are so much fun. And, before we had, I hate to say her name too loud because her ears will perk up, but Alexa, before we had that device, we had to do a playlist if we wanted to use Lena's song list to listen to while we were cooking. Now, all you do is ask, who to play the songs for you, and she does it while you're cooking. So it was an idea that was before its time, and now it's ideal.
Yeah, that sounds great, and I can imagine that. I don't have that. Uh, I can't say its name, I guess, or I can because I don't have one around me. But Alexa, yeah, that sounds good, and it sounds like it would work for anyone, and it worked for my wife. Although we didn't have the music to
Yeah,
listen to, she was bouncing around, singing around while she was cooking.
I
So
love that.
that was great. You two going to have to come on our show again together. Could you do that?
Oh, we would love to. And I have a bit of good news that I think might cheer you two up and put you in the holiday spirit. I got an email today from Chaz Newby saying that he was interested in coming on She Said, She Said in the spring. And I had written to him about your show and being on your show. And he said, if you two will contact him, and I have the email for you, he would love to come on your show.
Oh, that would be so great. I would love to have him on our show too. I'm sure Bob would too. And speaking of Bob, I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog and let him finish up here.
We're going to take a look at five of John's least understood songs that span his entire career from the earliest days in Hamburg up to the final days of the Beatles as a band. So we'll walk through these chronologically. Jude, could you give us your insight, which I've read some of the articles you read on these that are very interesting. Tell us about the first one, There's a Place.
Okay, There's a Place is really a remarkable song. It is such a significant song that Tim Riley once said, and I mean, this is big. If the Beatles had never recorded anything more than this, they would have secured themselves a place in pop history. I mean, that's a pretty big accolade. It is one of those remarkable songs that the Beatles recorded on the 11th of February, 1963, that outstanding day when those four young men gathered in EMI studios. Now, we call it Abbey Road today, but you have to remember that back in the day, no one referred to it as Abbey Road. That is post the Abbey Road LP when people started referring to the studio as Abbey Road. Back then, it was known as EMI Studios. And these young men gathered that morning on the 11th of February to record their very first LP. Today, we say, and especially in America, we call it an album. But in 1963, an album was something that an artist carried around with him to show people his work, like a portfolio. No one said album, you said an LP. And they were so excited to have the opportunity to be able to cut their very first long-playing record. Now, they've been on tour with Helen Shapiro in the coldest, bleakest winter that England had ever experienced. It had been sub-zero, icy roads, dangerous roads, and the Beatles had been on the Helen Shapiro tour on a cold, dank bus. Now, that coupled with the fact that they were singing in theaters and movie houses all over England, shaking hands with lots of people and running into lots of people, had caused them to have a little bit less physical endurance than they needed, and they were all sick. Every single one of them was sick, but John especially was running a high fever and he had a sore throat. And when they came into EMI that morning, they came in with tins of lozenges, throat lozenges. The brand that John used was Zubes, Z-U-B-E-S. Paul had a different brand. And they placed their throat lozenges on the piano in the studio. And John was asking first for hot tea to soothe his throat, hot tea with a little bit of lemon. Later in the day, when his throat was burning and hurting from almost 11 hours of recording, he started asking for cartons of cold milk to drink. But being sick back in the day, you know, if a recording artist is sick today, they'll take off. They won't show up to record, and they may take off a week or 2 weeks from recording. They may take 6 months to record something. But the Beatles, who were not known by anyone, were getting no slack. This was the day that they were set to record, and sick or not, they were expected to do it. So they begin to record first the songs that they know, songs that they had done in the cavern, songs that they knew very, very well. And they worked their way up to original songs. And this song, There's a Place, had a very special meaning for John. There's a book that's called A Hard Day's Right by Steve Turner. It's an excellent book about all of the Beatles recordings. And in it, he says of There's a Place, feelings of isolation and rejection would become a major preoccupation in John Lennon's songs. But There's a Place also introduced a second recurring theme that you hear in John's song, and that is that even though he's isolated, he finds comfort in his thoughts. In There's a Place, John deals with life's sorrow by retreating into the safety of his mind. So that's what Turner had to say about it. Now, you can find the same thing in lots of other John Lennon songs. Think about I'm Only Sleeping, or Rain, or In My Life, or Strawberry Fields Forever. John thinks about the past. He finds happiness in the people that went before him, the people that he's loved, in recalling happier times and happier places and cherished moments. And those things help to protect against the hurts of today. So that's going to be the theme of There's a Place. It's one of many, many songs that I point to when we get into this territory that I think is highly controversial, when people say that John Lennon didn't become an autobiographical lyricist before meeting Bob Dylan. Look, that's hogwash. This is a highly autobiographical song, born of the loneliness that John felt after his mother, for extremely complicated reasons, left him at 251 Menlove Avenue, the house called Mendips, to be raised by his Aunt Mimi and his Uncle George, or Uncle George, as John always called him. The song was written after his father, Fred, went back to sea, and he wrote to John many, many times after that, but Aunt Mimi would intercept the letters and tear them up. And finally, she wrote to Fred and said, look, quit bothering the boy. He's adjusting to his new life here with George and with me, and you need to leave him alone and let him adjust. Don't write to him anymore. So here's this little boy singing himself to sleep at night, which he did, and wondering why his parents left him, why they never get in touch with him, why he never sees them or hears from them. Well, one day his cousin says to John, you know, your mom lives only a mile away. And John's like, what do you mean? He said, yeah, she lives on Blomfield Road. And he takes John over to see her, where John discovers that not only is his mother living close by, but she's got a family. She has 2 little girls, Jackie and Julia. So now he's left with the reality that it isn't children that she doesn't want. It's just him. So with that hurt and that pain, he deals with a strange kind of loneliness that no other child has, the feeling of being unwanted. He thinks by both of his parents. Well, that goes on for many, many years. Julia does come. She does come to Mendips. He sees her now and again, but he never really feels like she loves him until the summer of 1955, when his Uncle George dies. And when that happens, Julia knocks on his bedroom door and tells him she's coming back into his life, not as a mother, because Mimi is really his mother at this point, but she's coming back as his best friend, and they begin to hang around together. She teaches him to play banjo. They go into stores and pull pranks on the shopkeepers. She encourages John to play hooky from school and hang out at her house, and they become best friends, like soulmates. And after about 1.5 to 2 years of this idyllic bonding, she's hit by a drunk driver, an off-duty policeman, knocked 40 feet into the air, and she is taken from John a second time, this time forever, by death. And he is devastated. I mean, he was destroyed. In fact, he didn't come out of his room for days. Mimi would leave food outside the door. He would take the food in, eat a tiny bit of it, and shove the tray back out. All John has to cling to now are these memories of his days with his mother. The days when she taught him to play piano and banjo, and she would bang around with that banjo. They would eat tea cakes and drink ginger beer, and they would dance to Elvis records. That's what he's living on. And she had always told him that he had music in his bones and he was destined to be a great performer. And he would, if he would just form a band, he would get to the toppermost of the poppermost. So, of course, he's done that, and he begins to really push his band toward the greatness that he knows would make his mother so proud of him. He pushes Alan Williams, a guy that owns the Jacaranda, to get his band a gig in Hamburg. And finally, in August of 1960, Alan Williams, sick of having John Lennon breathing down his neck about taking that band to Hamburg, finally agrees, and he takes them over there to perform at the Kaiser Keller. And as they're performing and they're playing 6 to 8 hours a night with almost no breaks, they're honing themselves as a great band. When they have time off, they begin to hang around in this place where sailors are fed, where sailors come for a hot breakfast and a place to sleep. And at night, there's a bar that the sailors can hang around in. It's called the Seamen's Mission. Well, one Sunday around noon, the Beatles have put in a long Saturday night, a very long night. They go in to have a late breakfast in the Seamen's Mission, and John is in a funk. He's depressed. He's thinking that they're going nowhere. They've just signed on for another month in Hamburg. They're going to be there through December, but he's missing his home. He's missing his girlfriend, Cynthia, and he's living in the Bambino behind a movie theater, this 8x8 concrete, filthy room, and he's wondering if all of this is worth it. He's very unhappy. So he wanders into a side room in the Seamen's Mission that's cold. The bar heaters aren't turned on until 2 in the afternoon. He sits down at the little out-of-tune piano and he begins to plunk out a song that has a little bit of a Motown sound to it, kind of like Smokey Robinson and the Miracles that he really loves, kind of a Marvin Gaye kind of sound to it. And he begins to write about the way he feels. And he has the first few words when he sits down. There's a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue. He gets up from that piano and he gets a napkin, and at the cash register, he finds an ink pen and he begins to scribble on the napkin the words that are starting to come to him at that piano. When I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind. That's where I can go. You know, when I feel bad, I can go to my mind. And there's no time when I'm alone. Well, why is there no time when I'm alone? Because I think of you. And the things you do go round my head, the things you said. Immediately, the girl who is always with him is there again. That girl that he loves so much, the one that he lost twice, once when he was a little boy and now to death, Julia. The things you said go round my head like I love only you. In my mind, there's no sorrow. Don't you know that it's so? There'll be no sad tomorrow. Don't you know that it's so? Because there's a place where I can go when I feel low, when I feel blue, and it's my mind. And there's no time when I'm alone. There's a place. It is a beautiful autobiographical confessional song where John's admitting his pain, his loss, his yearning to fill the hole that he has in his heart ever since his mother died. This song is written in 1960 in Hamburg, and it's recorded in 1963. That is years before John met Bob Dylan. And if you listen to the words of this song, you know all that you ever need to know about John Lennon, about his pain, about his longing for his mother. You learn him inside and out. When they begin to put the music with these beautiful words, and John added that harmonica or harp, you listen to it and you hear it ends on an unresolved note, that harmonica never finds a happy place to land. It's a mournful sound, and it kind of limps behind the tempo of the song just a little bit, because it's showing us a wounded writer, a limping writer, this young man who has been wounded by the loss of his mother. You also hear that pain in the chords. They're very dark. They're searching for relief. And this is John telling you who he is. When he does find that relief in the song, it's in his mind. And he emphasizes those words, "and it's my mind," with a real heavy drum beat, almost underlining for us all that that is the place that he finds happiness. Listen, guys, I'm telling you, this is where I can go to be happy. In his mind, in his soul, Julia is still there, and every time he thinks of her, it makes him happy. This song, to me, established John as an extremely accomplished composer, even though he writes it when he's really only 19 years old. It establishes him as a lyricist with great depth, and to me, it completely dispels the rumor that Bob Dylan had to teach John how to write great music. If you listen to this song, you can tell it just isn't so.
Well, I digress a bit, but there's a play sounds that reminds me a bit in your description of Brian Wilson's "In My Room." But on
Absolutely.
But on that thought, I'm going to call on my partner Warren Brown to continue with this interesting dialogue.
Hey, Jude, no pun intended. Zoobs, hot tea, cold milk. I'm starting to get thirsty here. You delve so deeply into all things John. John was really writing a lot of songs in a short period of time. This track really speaks to the heart of who John was. Can you tell us about "I'll Cry Instead"?
Yes, we all have a mutual friend, the Hicks family, Dwayne, Andrea, and Cameron Hicks. And I know they're friends of yours, and they've been on the show before, and they're good friends of mine. And about 2 or 3 months ago, Dwayne asked me, he said, if you had to just point to one song that you would say is the quintessential John Lennon song, what would it be? Would it be "Imagine"? Would it be "In My Life"? And I said, no, the quintessential John Lennon song is "I'll Cry Instead." And he's like, what? And, people don't think of that as the definitive Lennon song, but let's look at it. It was written by what the world considered to be a very successful, powerful, sought-after young Beatle who appeared to have the world on a string. He had fame, he had power, he had girls, he had money, he had success. The world thought he had everything. But in truth, this song was penned by a young man who was shivering inside with the pain of this unbelievable love that was denied to him, that love for which he longed, the love that he never really got to have, the love of Julia Stanley Lennon. And it had always been for John the thing that defined his life. There's a story that Pete Shotton tells, and I covered it in volume 1 of the John Lennon series, Should Have Been There. And it's a story about John when he was probably about, I'm going to guess, about 9 or 10 years old. And he was at St. Peter's Church in Woolton, where both he and Pete went to Sunday school. And the Sunday school teacher, who was getting to know the kids at the beginning of a new year, probably as they've changed grades and they've moved to a new Sunday school teacher, is asking them all to stand up and to tell their name and to tell a little bit about their family. Well, as it goes from kid to kid to kid, moving closer to John Lennon, he is sweating bullets. He is utterly humiliated. He's praying that he'll die before it gets to him, because he doesn't want to stand up in that room of ordinary kids with ordinary parents and ordinary lives and say, I don't know where my parents are. I don't know where my mom is. I don't know where my dad is. I live with my aunt and uncle. He is utterly humiliated. And that was kind of the way that John went through the rest of his life. In the early days of Beatlemania, if you go back and look at what he tells the reporters and journalists, he tells them he's an orphan. He says both of his parents are dead rather than to admit that Fred is still alive and he doesn't know anything about where his dad is. He was so hurt by being abandoned by his parents and so insecure and so in need of love that he was always sure that people were looking down on him, talking about him, pitying him, and seeing him as crippled inside. So one of the stories I think that really characterizes John's feeling that you see in I'll Cry Instead happened when he started Liverpool College of Art in September of 1958. He was in the registration room and he was getting his classes and going around from table to table and registering for classes. And this girl shouts across the registration room, "Hey, John Lennon, wasn't that your mother that was killed by a drunk driver then?" Mm. And he says, yeah, it was, and acts like he doesn't care. And then when people's eyes go away from him, he stumbles out of the room into the alleyway and leans against the wall with tears in his eyes. He hated it when people would stop and stare.
I can imagine.
Yeah, he didn't want to be different. He didn't want to be the kid that didn't have parents or the kid whose mother got killed by a drunk driver. And he tells you in this song, he changed the very first line several times. At one point he said, "I've got every reason on earth to be sad." But really what he meant was, "I've got every reason on earth to be mad. I'm really frustrated about the way my life has been. I just lost the only girl I had. What would I do if I could have my way? I'd give up. I just could give up, but I can't. So instead of giving up, what am I going to do? I'm going to cry instead." Here's John Lennon in one line, "I've got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet." And what does he tell us all the time in Beatlemania? Why is he snarky and smart aleck? Because he can't talk to people that he meets. And if he could see, he's thinking both about Mimi, who threw away his paintings and didn't keep them, when he said, "Why are you throwing that away? You better hang on to that. I'm going to be famous someday." Or to his mother, there's anger involved in loss. Sometimes you feel anger at the person for leaving you behind. If I could see you now, I try to make you sad somehow, but I can't. So what am I going to do? I'm going to cry instead. Really, here's the essence of John Lennon. I don't want to cry when there's people there. I get shy when they shout and stare. This is him telling you exactly who he is, word for word. This is his life story. What is he going to do about it? Well, he's going to come back. He's going to gather his strength like the phoenix rising out of the ashes. And when he does, you better hide all the girls, because I'm going to break their hearts around the world. I'm going to break them in two and show you what your loving man can do. I'm going to show you what I'm capable of. You should have loved me. You should have cared for me. You should have valued me, because I am special and I'm going to prove it to you. But till then, I'll cry instead. What is more autobiographical with this song? It is another one that I really point to. This is long before he meets Dylan or hears the album Freewheelin'. This is John being very autobiographical long before that meeting. It was what he always did. He was kind of like Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. He always wanted to grab you by the arm and tell you his story. And boy, does he ever tell it in I'll Cry Instead.
Yeah, he had a real rough upbringing there, and I can imagine the way he felt. And I do totally agree with you. He is very autobiographical in all his songs, in my opinion, anyway. Can you tell us about And Your Bird Can Sing? It's a beautiful track. Can you talk about that one?
Sure. Warren, I really used to wonder what in the world is this song about. And obviously, everyone else did too, because I've seen so many interpretations of this song. Some people say that, John got jealous because Frank Sinatra won LP of the year. And so he's writing this song for Frank Sinatra. John wasn't writing for Frank. He wasn't that mad at Frank Sinatra because he got album of the year. He could care less. I mean, it's not, he didn't wish other people ill, and he wasn't jealous when other people had success. It didn't matter that much, especially by the time that he's writing And Your Bird Can Sing. He's over it. He's had fame. It's no big deal. Other people say that this is written for some one night stand, but let's take a look. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at the clues and see who this song is really about. Now, probably because John had a chip on his shoulder that was bigger than his feet, he could do anger like no one could do. I mean, think about Run for Your Life, or You Can't Do That, or How Do You Sleep at Night. He had absolutely no problems articulating anger or indignation. And he is in this song very angry and very frustrated. He is really deeply hurt. So he can't be speaking to someone that he doesn't know or some girl that he met for one night, because in this song, he is hurt. He is furious, but he's not going to abandon the person, even though they wounded him, because he says to the person, look in my direction. I'll be round. I'll be round. In other words, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm still going to be around, even though I think you're not doing what is right, even though you're hurting me. So let's go through the clues and see who John is talking to. So the first clue is that John says the person has everything he wants. Well, so we know from that this person is well-to-do. They're probably living in a chic location. They're driving a prized car. They're making headlines, possibly, maybe rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous, maybe having a powerful career because they have everything they want. Number two, the person has seen 7 wonders. So we know by that the person is well-traveled. They've seen the world, probably from the Spanish Riviera to the width and breadth of North America, to exotic Hong Kong and New Zealand and Australia. Who could that be? This person is cosmopolitan, probably more cosmopolitan than John, more polished and more experienced. Clue number 3, the person purports to have heard every sound there is. Now, this tidbit is cluing us to the fact that this might be written to someone in the music industry, because this person says they've heard every sound there is. Now, notice the words, you say you've heard every sound there is. You say you're a music expert. We get the feeling that this individual pretends to know more about music than perhaps they even know. Maybe they've even made a few unwelcome suggestions to John about his compositions and his performances. So clue number 4, the person has strange, quirky, idiomatic tastes, because after all, his bird is green. And that leads us to perceive this person as having exotic taste, being a little bit different and singular and outstanding for his day. Finally, clue number 5, this person is extremely important to John. In fact, according to the lyrics, at an earlier point during their relationship, this person got him. This person understood him. This person saw him. And now he doesn't see him. He doesn't get him. And John is striking out with a verbal attack. So who could it be that fits this 5-point profile, who had an intimate relationship with John, so intimate that he shared John's secrets and John shared his, and they trusted each other? Who had he been so close to that he might get this angry with? Who had been his advocate before world travels and possessions and the demands of business and the intricate web of power struggles set in? Who could this be? Who do you think it was, Warren?
A good guess would be his manager.
That's it, Brian Epstein. And he's mad. He's mad at Brian. And the fact that he talks about the green bird really highlights Brian's identity, because a bird in Liverpool, of course, is a girl, and the bird is swinging. So, swinging in Liverpool was stepping out from the norm sexually. Well, this is a
Hmm.
reference to a friend who has a green bird, a bird who swings. In all likelihood, John was making a dig at the fact that Brian was gay. In fact, if you listen to Anthology and you hear the version of the song on there, Paul and John break into little snickers when they say this line. So they know that they're saying something a little bit naughty. Definitely, John is talking to Brian Epstein in the song. And what is he upset with him about? Well, John and George have been telling Brian for over a year now that they are tired of touring, and they are sick of working tirelessly day in and day out. And he's
Hmm.
trying to say to Brian, I know what you want. I know you want us to constantly do films and tours, singles and interviews and radio shows and personal appearances. But you told me that you were in my corner. You said you were my friend. And now you don't get me. You don't see me. You don't hear me. And I'm angry about it. But he does say at the end of the song that whenever you get tired of all these things that are so fleeting and so important to you, if you look in my direction, I'll be round. I'll still be your friend. And so, even though Brian had let him down in John's eyes, he still was going to be his friend. And that really is in your and your bird can sing.
Yes, that is a very good description of that song, and something I never knew or even thought of. But it all does make sense, and I am very interested in reading your new book, John Lennon series. And what is the title of the book that's coming out?
The new one is Shades of Life. And
Shades of Light.
I probably be about another year and a half. I'm still working away. Took a little break to run up to New York City for the Macy's parade for Thanksgiving with my family. So
Wow,
tomorrow I'm back nose to the grindstone and get the Beatles through the Bahamas and on to Austria for the making of Help.
awesome. It sounds like you had a nice vacation in New York. That would have been nice to see.
It was really fun. We were so worried that the balloons were not going to fly because the winds were so high. But instead of getting rid of them, they just lowered them to 10 feet. And that was really special because you got to see the balloons up close and personal. It was a great experience.
Yeah, I saw on the news that a couple of the balloons did fall on some people there.
Yeah, yeah. And it was cold. It was a bitterly cold day. But you have not lived life until you've gotten on a subway after the Macy's parade. 10,000 other people who are doing the same thing.
Oh, I can imagine. It's a trip when there's only a few people in there. I can imagine that many.
It was something.
Yes. Well, with all that being said, I hear the bulldog back there growling, so I'm going to let him bark at you for a little bit, and I'll get back to you real soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
An interesting song is Revolution. They had a couple of different versions of it, and I know George Martin had said he didn't think the song itself was very solid, but the Beatles could turn any song into something special. I think a lot of the times, not to knock their lyrics, but their singing and overall performance is bigger than the lyrics themselves on paper. But what about Revolution and that in and out in business? I mean, they came in one of the two versions.
Yeah, to me, that is one of the most quizzical reactions that Beatles fans have to anything that John ever wrote. But let's start at the beginning and we'll get to it because to me it's mind blowing, and I bet you feel exactly the same way, Bob. Revolution is definitely a song of firsts because it is the first time that a Beatles song came out in three different versions. The other two, of course, being Revolution 9 and Revolution, which is the so-called B-side to Hey Jude. And then there was Revolution 1, which is on the White Album, and it is definitely an interesting song. It is also the first time that an outside person is admitted into the closed Beatles circle to be a part of the song. And that is none other than Yoko Ono, who was present during the recording and gave her opinions about what should be done with Revolution. But, you know, that does all depend on what your definition of the Beatles closed circle is, because, you know, from the very earliest of days, George Martin made suggestions about how the songs should be handled. Instead of playing da 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 dum dum da, he told them they were going to sing that da 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 dum dum da, and they're like, what? We're going to sing that? So George, from the very earliest days, was making suggestions. Mal Evans many times added hand claps and percussion, and George had Indian musicians come into the studio on Within You Without You to perform. So Yoko being in the studio and being a part of the circle wasn't all that different, but she was changing what the Beatles were doing and giving suggestions. So in that aspect, there was a little bit of difference to it. What is revolutionary is that in the absence of Brian Epstein, the Beatles are starting to do something with this song Revolution that he had asked them never, ever to do. And that is to discuss their political views. They always wanted to speak out politically. John and really all of the Beatles were floored when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Art Schreiber, who toured with John on the North American tour and was a big, big newsman for the Westinghouse news organization, told me that John used to seek him out every night and say, Art, let's go talk, let's go talk. Or they'd play a game of Monopoly. And while they were playing, he would say, Art, why was John Kennedy killed? What's going on? And the Beatles were terrified to go to Dallas when they performed there on the 1964 North American tour. They were very politically interested and active. And John read 2 to 3 newspapers every single day. He knew politics. He liked to discuss it with a journalist on the tours. And he always would say to Brian, you know, if they ask me about the war, I'm going to answer. I can't ignore it. And Brian would say, no, we're not getting into that. You're a musician. You're not a politician. Don't say anything. Well, in this song, John is finally going to speak out. But the answer that John gives in this song disappointed a lot of people. It was not the answer that the extreme group of the 1960s, the late 1960s wanted. It didn't make Jerry Rubin happy. It didn't make the SDS happy. It didn't make the underground movement happy, because the song did not espouse violence, nor did it espouse random, unplanned, riotous revolution. John very clearly says, okay, you say you want revolution? Great. I'd like to see your plan. Show me your plan. I want to see what you have planned. He was really an intelligent, critical thinker. He always wanted to know how something was going to be accomplished. When Brian would talk about getting the group a recording contract, it was John who said, who are you going to see? How are you going to do it? Who are you going to approach? He always wanted to know step by step how something was going to be done. He was constantly bugging Alan Williams, their first manager, to get them jobs. And he would say, who are you going to call for us, Al? Who are you going to contact for us, Al? He always wanted to know step by step how something was going to happen. And here with Revolution, he's saying the same thing. If you want to change the world, you need to have a concrete plan. He's definitely rejecting violence as a way of bringing about change. He had read many books on Gandhi, and he believed in Gandhi's peaceful revolution. And no one more than John Lennon knew that death and killing could ruin a life forever. He had been there when his mother was hit by that drunk driver, and he went to the hospital with John Dykins, his stepfather, and was there in the hospital when his mother died, and knew how much that changed and ruined his life. And he wanted nothing to do with killing. He had been so shocked by not only the assassination of Kennedy, but by Bobby Kennedy as well, and Martin Luther King, So his stance was not for violence, but his stance was for peace. So when he originally records Revolution, he sings, "When it comes to violence, count me out." But beneath the surface of this man who believes in peace and this man who wants peace lurks a northern man. You know, the men from the north of England, from Liverpool, from Manchester, they were known as really tough guys. When Bob Wooler, in the early days of the Beatles, when in 1963, when Brian had taken John on holiday to the Spanish Riviera, Bob Wooler and a bunch of people teased John about going on a Spanish honeymoon with Brian Epstein. And John put up with it at first and tried to ignore them. But after a while, he'd had enough of it. And what did he do? He beat Bob Wooler up. Hidden inside John Lennon is still this guy who has violence in his soul. After Litherland Town Hall performance in the early days of the Beatles, when Stu Sutcliffe was playing with the band, Stu went out to load the van and a group of toughs jumped on Stu and started beating him up. John just happened to be the next person coming out to the van, and he went insane at seeing what they were doing to his best friend. And single-handedly, until Pete joined them about 5 minutes later, John tore into those guys with such a vengeance that he beat them off of Stu without someone else to help him, broke his little finger in the process. But living inside this peaceful man, there is still a violent man who knows that that's not the way to go. So he admits in his version of the song, "You can count me out /in." Now, what boggles my mind is that in 2019, when there are all these people saying that they're for gun control and that we can't have guns available to people and we can't have violence, yet these same people are saying they want John to say, "You can count me out in." They're disappointed in John when he says, "You can count me out." In fact, they've called him a coward. They have said that he wasn't taking a strong enough stance and that he should have called for revolution that embraced anything to make revolution happen. Look, John's bottom line in this song is the strongest stance that a human being can take when he says, if you want revolution, you know what you need to do? You need to free your mind instead. He's saying revolution comes when you change yourself. That's the hardest change to make. That's the greatest change to make, altering yourself. And to me, that is the strongest stance that he could have taken. Not saying, if you don't change, we're going to kill you, we're going to shoot you, we're going to be violent. But saying, if you want to change the world, you need to change you. It's rational, it's controlled, it's a powerful call for peace, and it definitely prefigures what he's going to do in the 1970s. He received so much criticism for this song. They called him a millionaire revolutionary. Even Paul and George said that they found his stance embarrassing, that he should have called for violence to bring about change. But that's not what John was about, and that certainly isn't what he was about in the 1970s. This is one of my very, very favorite songs. I think you see not only who John had become by the late 1960s, but who he was going to grow into in his later years. And when he left us in 1980, he was very proud of the version that said, "You can count me out," and he stood by it.
Just to belabor the point a little, what about when he changed it on the White Album to "out in"?
Yeah, well, like I said, inside of him was that old violent John that was lurking inside. And he admits that old violent John that beat up Bob Wooler and that smashed those guys at Litherland, that guy is still living inside of him. And that guy might sometime pop up, but he hopes that he doesn't. And he hopes he can suppress that guy and be the stronger guy who doesn't rely on violence to solve his problems.
But couldn't it's just interesting that this song said that. Like, that's on a personal level. But what about, like, socially, like, people hearing that? Like, I just think that was kind of a dangerous thing to say.
Yeah, and he's pressured into saying it by people saying, "Well, you're being a coward. You should have taken a stronger stance." Paul and George especially saying that they found his stance embarrassing and that he needed to be stronger. But he is admitting what all of us should be admitting. Inside all of us, despite the fact that we intend to be peaceful and we intend to be good and we intend to be kind, there is inside all of us the natural man who has a tendency toward all things evil. And he's admitting that. He's saying that person is still inside of me. You can count me out, but sometimes you'll count me in. Sometimes I'm going to do things I don't approve of. But, we all have to admit that person is inside of us.
Good point. And the other song that gets to us that we're going to get onto is Come Together. And I know, of course, you're going to have an interesting insight into that. I was wondering, Chuck Berry's link to that song, if you can catch that up in there too.
Sure. Now, this is one of my very, very favorite songs because it has so much to it that people don't really realize exists. They think it's just about this weird character, old flat top, who come grooving up slowly, which of course, as you just pointed out, is Chuck Berry's line. It's from his song, You Can't Catch Me. And people think that this whole song is about this one character, this old flat top character, and that he's being described throughout the song, but it's not. It's about 4 different characters. And as we go through the characters, I think you might just recognize who they are. But let's back up before we meet the 4 characters and talk about when this song was written. John started it in January of 1969. The Beatles had come together in the studio after months of being apart and fighting with one another and being at odds to start working on the Let It Be project. And they have no intention at the point that they come together in January of 69 of making 2 LPs, Abbey Road and Let It Be. They think they're just going to be doing one big creative work. And John has started writing this song. He is coming into the studio to make what is eventually going to be the Abbey Road LP with hope in his heart. Hope that they can get together and work together again. Hope that they can get along, hope that they can do something positive and create something positive in the studio. Hope is the theme of the Abbey Road LP. And he's been inspired by none other than Timothy Leary with the title for this song. Leary was a guy who lived in California taught at Berkeley University and was really espousing the use of drugs in the late 1960s to open your mind and make you creative. He was the #1 person associated with drug use. And so when he decided to run for governor of California, Leary's slogan in his gubernatorial race was "Come together, join the party," meaning joining his political party and also joining the fun and the party of taking drugs. Well, Leary met John at the Bed-In for Peace in Montreal, and he asked John, because he sang on Give Peace a Chance, if John would do a favor for him. And John said, sure. What favor do you want? Leary said, well, I've got this slogan, come together, join the party. Can you write me a song that I can use for my gubernatorial campaign? And John started working on a version of a very different, primitive version of Come Together. Well, unfortunately, Leary was arrested for possession of marijuana in the latter part of 1969. So definitely his race for governor was out, and Ronald Reagan won the election. And so the song that John was writing for Leary just sat there doing nothing. So he took it and he started reworking it. And instead of writing about Timothy Leary, he started writing about what he hoped to see when the Beatles came together in Abbey Road. So he's telling you about these 4 characters. Now, the first one that we meet is described as one holy roller. Well, already you might guess who that would be from that description. One holy roller. This guy has hair down below his knees, and he is a guy who has got to be a joker. Now, if you think back to June of 1962, when the Beatles came into EMI Studios and George Martin was talking to them about the possibility of recording for EMI, he gave them this big lecture. And he said, if you're going to work for us, you're going to be on time, you're going to dress nicely, you're going to behave yourself, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. And then he turned to them and said, look, is there anything that you don't like, anything that you'd like to say? And George Harrison piped up, I don't like your tie. George Harrison was always the joker of the group. So that first character, the one holy roller, the joker, is George Harrison. Then in the second verse, there's this character that doesn't put on any sham. He wears no shoe shine. He's not going to be someone he's not. He looks people straight in the eye and he says, I know you and you know me. Not going to be anything fancy. And he's the only Beatle who was asked to shoot an ad for Coca-Cola. That is, of course, our straightforward boy from the Dingle, Richard Starkey, or Ringo. Then in the third verse, you meet this character that's got bag production. He's got walrus gumboot. He's got Ono sideboard, and he's a spinal cracker. And he's got feet down through his knees. Holds you in his armchair. You can feel his disease. Well, clearly, that's our boy, John Lennon. He was doing artwork under the guise of Bag Productions. He had Yoko Ono as his sidekick or his sideboard. He definitely would make people laugh. He was a spinal cracker. He would say all kinds of sarcastic, witty things. And John always thought that he was crippled inside, that you could feel his disease. And then finally, you meet that last character who, Roller Coaster. Well, who had just written a single called Get Back that was publicized as a roller coaster song. Paul, of course, Paul who loved Muddy Waters, Paul who was the PR man for the Beatles, always had mojo filter going on, the kind of person that could say one and one is three, and it sounded cool and groovy, and who was definitely known as the cute Beatle. He had to be good looking because he was so hard to see. That fourth character is definitely Paul. When these four characters come together, you get the four-headed being, that's the Beatles. And when they come together in studio, John is hoping that they'll be able to come together all together and work together to create something marvelous. And that's what Come Together was all about.
It's interesting that all four of them are in there and such. I confused the one about Ringo for a while. I thought was Paul just from listening to the song. I didn't know about the Coca-Cola ad. So
yeah.
Pretty
and
cool.
You know, I think Paul wears shoe shine. Paul always wants to put his best foot forward, and he is the one, anytime that there's trouble, like when the Beatles hit the little old lady that was parked in Scotland at a stop sign and they ran into her with their van, they sent Paul out to put a good spin on it and to get them out of trouble. Anytime something bad would happen, they would ask Paul to get them out of it. So he's not really the one that's straightforward. I know you, you know me. That's Ringo. Ringo is just, I am who I am, like it or not. But Paul was the one that always had the great spin. He is the one with the mojo filter.
I thought Paul was the one that never wore shoes.
I think he just got tired of it that one day.
And sorry I had to put that in there.
Well, we're just going to ask something that's a little off the beaten path of what we're talking about. But I've been reading lately, and Phil Spector keeps coming up. And, that they brought him in on Let It Be, and that Paul had such a bad experience, with him because he didn't want his songs messed with. And then John became kind of close to, it didn't dawn on me before, but Paul couldn't seem to stand the way the guy interacted with the Beatles. And then John kind of embraced him in the solo years. So he kept on with Phil Spector after that. So this week, as I knew we were going to talk, I was saying I had to ask you that question if you had any thoughts about John and Phil Spector.
Yeah, that's really out of my area right now. The way I do these books, and people might, find this interesting, is I am surrounded right now with, I'm looking at about 120 books. They're all around me. I'm in kind of a cockpit. Surrounded by 3 tables that go around me in a U with books spread everywhere. and piles of articles and newspapers and magazines and all sorts of information. And I research the realm that I'm in and do interviews and try to learn everything I can possibly learn. So I am up to 1965. So other than encountering Ronnie Spector, who of course John was very interested in, and
well, bail me out and tell that story.
Yeah. So
bail me out of the hole. I got to fix it.
Well, John, Ronnie Spector had come over to England. In fact, she was on the plane flying back to America when the Beatles went there in 1964 for that February trip when they were going to be on Ed Sullivan, and she was on the plane traveling back home. But he was very taken by her and walked her up to the rooftop of one of the downtown London buildings to show her the sunset, as it were, which really ended up with him hitting on her. And she said, "Look, you're married and I'm not interested, and we need to stay good friends and leave it at that." And they did. But he, after that, he would always seek Ronnie Spector out to visit with her and talk with her. And that's how he got to know Phil, through Ronnie. And then was intrigued by the fact that Phil was so out of the box. John always loved people who were out of the box. And that aspect of him really interested John. He thought that the wall of sound was incredible. He was intrigued with Spector's great sound that he could create. But of course, that shine wore off in later years when John and May were out in California and Phil was carrying a gun with him in a holster. At that point, John started to rethink his relationship with Phil Spector.
Can't say as I blame him.
Yeah.
That was a good story. Thanks for bailing me out when I asked that one here and dug myself in a hole there. Go back to Warren now and see what he's got to say.
Some very good insights to some great Beatles songs, Jude. I really love your descriptions, and they are things that I never thought of. From now on, when I listen to them songs, I'm going to think of those. And I also liked your little da-da-da, da-da-dum-dum-da. I thought that was pretty cute.
Can't you imagine how shocked they were when George Martin said, "You're going to sing that instead of play guitar"?
Yeah, I can imagine. That would have been funny. We got a very important date coming up here real soon, and I'm going to try to get this released around that day, if not a day before. What are your thoughts on December the 8th?
Well, the wound never goes away, and it's always a very sad day. And in fact, one time, several years ago, I was at my parents' house. They have a Christmas festival. If you've seen the movie Steel Magnolias, that's where I grew up, in the town that movie takes place in. And they have a Christmas festival. They show it in the film, and it's always on that weekend. That is December 8th. And I was asleep and getting up the next day to go to the Christmas festival. And I was dreaming that I was looking from above at something tragic going on in an operating room. And as I was coming down closer and closer and closer to this tragic scene, I realized it was John having been shot. And I just woke up screaming, crying. And this was probably 20 years after John's death. So I didn't even know it was December 8th, but that's my mind knew, and it was, right. It knew, even if I didn't know consciously. I think the wound never heals, but I think this world was never the place for John. This world always treated him badly. He said, "The world is treating me bad, misery."
I agree.
He didn't belong here. It wasn't the place for him. And after he died, in so many years, I prayed for him. And I just kept saying, let me have some kind of sign that he's happy. Let me have some kind of sign that he's at peace. Let me have some kind of sign that he has found happiness. And then in the 1990s, they released Free as a Bird. home at last, safe and dry. And I thought, that's it. So even though I'm sad for all of us, and I'm sad that we've lost a genius, I'm happy for John.
Yes, I'm happy for John too, and very sad that he's gone from this world anyway. He was the voice of all of us little people. It was a very sad day coming up, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. With that being said, I'm going to go off track, and I want to ask you about your next podcast and the release of your wonderful new book. When is that due out again?
It'll probably be at the Fest for Beatles fans, not this coming August, but the August after that. Mark and Carol Lapidos, who have been like, even though we're the same age, I mean, we are probably 2 or 3 years apart in age, they have become adopted parents to me, and they are always, there for me and encouraging me and just being the kind of parents that everybody would want to have. And so they've agreed to do my book releases at the Fest. So we're shooting for a year and a half, but I've got to get myself in high gear and quit fooling around and start really, really putting time in at the computer. But that's what we're looking at. It's going to be Shades of Life. It's going to cover 1965. And it's called Shades of Life because everything that the Beatles did in 64, they repeat almost verbatim in 1965, except for this time, the shine has worn off of it. The new is gone. They've already done it. They're doing the same thing again. And so it's almost like a negative or a shade of what they did before. They're beginning to lose some of their enthusiasm and zest because it's been there, done that, got the t-shirt. It's a difficult year. It's a turning point for them. They move from the happy-go-lucky, want to get to the top Beatles to a point where from then on out, things are going to start to go down.
Right. Is that the Fest for Beatles fans in New York or Chicago?
In Chicago. We always do it in Chicago. New York is the Fest in Jersey is held the last week of March, and everybody get your tickets. The hotel for the March one is already full, but there are lots of great hotels that are around nearby within walking distance. And the scenery at that hotel is magnificent. You're in Jersey,
it is.
You're overlooking downtown New York. There's so many great people that are going to be there. It's lots of fun. It's trying to decide what to do because you have a choice each hour of about 6 different activities. And it is a weekend not to be missed.
Yes, it is. And I will hopefully be there. And I don't live but 2 hours from there, so I don't need to get a hotel. But I will be there, and I was hoping to see you there, but I guess you'll be at the one in Chicago then.
Well, I come to both. I do both. But the book release will be at the one in Chicago in 2021. But I will be at the Jersey Fest, so I'll see you there.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm looking forward to that. And can you tell us about your next podcast again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Coming up in January, we'll be talking with Anthony Rotuno, who has a John Lennon podcast out of Europe and talking about his insights on John Lennon. Then in February, we are going to be with Elliot Easton of the Cars and Anthony Babiuk as Anthony and Elliot drop the new CD by the Empty Hearts, their band, the Empty Hearts, on Valentine's Day. And we're going to play some cuts from their new CD. And then in March, we will be talking with Rogue and Pete Best about Rogue's Magical Mystery Museum in Liverpool and what Pete has planned for 2020 and find out if he has any tours or what he's going to be doing. And then April, Angie and Ruth McCartney, and May, the Beatles' first bass player, Mr. Chaz Newby.
Awesome. And that sounds good. All interesting stuff. Where can people find that on the internet?
It is on Podbean, but we share it on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Facebook, and on Twitter. And it is She Said on Facebook and also on Instagram.
Okay, sounds great to me. We're gonna finish the show by singing a song, The End, and I would appreciate it if you could join in. But first, I want to ask the Bulldog, see if he's got anything else he'd like to say.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of Jude Kessler, Warren Brown, and myself, and we hope you've enjoyed the discussion.
Great job, Bob.
Thank you. I love being here. Thank you so much for having me on the show. Thank
you. You're welcome, and I hope you will join us in singing The End. And we'll let Bob do the first part. You can take the middle, and I'll take the end. How's that?
All right.
You ready?
Ready.
You're ready. A trooper. And in the end,
the love you make
is equal to the love you make. Awesome job, guys.